Today's video is about the causes and consequences of trade deficit. Causes, reasons, consequences, effects. And trade deficit is when exports of goods are less than imports of goods. Do remember, trade balance records the exports and imports of goods only. These goods could be primary goods like wheat, rice, and they could be manufactured goods like electronics and like automobiles. And they could be capital goods like machinery, and they could be consumer goods such as new television. All these goods, import and export, is part of trade balance. So whenever you talk about trade balance, do refer to goods. So trade deficit when exports of goods are less than imports of goods. One of the reasons for trade deficit is poor industrial base and poor productivity of labor. Poor industrial base could be a reason or could be a consequence of poor investment in infrastructure. And of course, poor skills, poor low productivity of labor could be because of poor education and less investment in human resource development. If a country lacks the correct infrastructure, they lack the culture of producing high quality, high value added manufactured goods, they often struggle to export. Exports usually become of those goods which are primary goods, raw materials whose value is not very high, whereas their imports are more expensive. Because of this, the exports are less than imports. If the productivity is low because of poor education, because of poor skills of workers, because of poor investment in their health, workers are not trained enough, they are not educated enough, and they are unable to produce high quality goods, and that country will struggle to maintain their trade balance, and they will often have exports less than their import. So one reason I explained, poor industrial base and lack of productivity. The other reason could be the overvalued exchange rate. Overvalued exchange rate, countries often keep their exchange rate at a high level to achieve certain economic objectives. That overvalued exchange rate would mean that the goods made by their country will be expensive for foreigners. Remember, when you buy goods of another country, you do not buy only the good of their country, you also buy the currency of their country. So if the currency of that country is expensive, goods you buy from their country will also be expensive. So overvalued exchange rate could make your exports less price competitive both at home and abroad. On the other hand, overvalued exchange rate may make your imports look cheaper, and that would mean that more imports will be coming in and less exports will be going out, and that will lead to a trade deficit. The third reason for trade deficit could be a comparatively high inflation rate. If the inflation rate in comparison with your trading partners is high, it means prices of your goods are rising faster than the prices of goods in another country. Your export, your goods will become less price competitive, and people will switch to goods which are cheaper in other countries. And that comparative high inflation rate would also be a reason of trade deficit. Another reason is strong economy. If your economy is growing, if your economy has robust consumer demand, if economy has more income and more employment, that mean that people have more affordability and they may import more goods, and that could lead to trade deficit. Economic growth may also mean the requirement of businesses to import raw materials and machinery is also rising, and that could also lead to rising import and rising trade deficit. So I've given you four reasons. There could be multiple other reasons as well. For the sake of an A-level essay, these four reasons, development of them could be enough. Now we move on to discussion on the consequences of trade deficit. One consequence, the net exports fall. Net export is the difference between exports and imports. And since net exports are negative in case of a trade deficit, aggregate demand falls. You remember, aggregate demand equals consumer spending, investment spending, government spending, and net exports. So if net exports fall and trade deficit rises, that would mean aggregate demand would rise. Demand will be withdrawn from the economy, and that would lead to lower AD, and lower AD would mean real GDP. Always label all curves properly. So what happens when net exports fall? When net exports fall, AD falls, and because of fall in AD, real GDP and employment falls. So one of the consequences of trade deficit is rising unemployment and falling real GDP. The other consequence of trade deficit could be your reserves of foreign currencies will deplete. In case there is trade deficit and there is no other inflow coming in, maybe in the form of workers' remittances or in the form of direct foreign investment, if there is no inflow coming in and there is only trade deficit, that would mean there will be a downward pressure on the reserves of foreign currencies. Countries do keep reserves of foreign currencies for economic emergencies, and in case there is a trade deficit, means exports are less than import, meaning inflows of foreign currency are less than the outflows, then from where you'll get the remaining. Maybe through foreign remittances, maybe through FDI. But if FDI and foreign remittances are not enough, in that case, reserves will start depleting, reserves will start falling, and that would put a strain on a country's economic policies. That is a worrying sign. If reserves keep falling, that would mean the sovereignty of their country, the economic sovereignty of their country is in a doubt. And of course, it will mean that other countries may hesitate to lend you money, or other commercial banks of the world may also force you to repay their loans as quickly as possible, because they think the risk associated by lending to your country is going up as your reserves, your security cushion is falling. So fall in reserves is dangerous in many ways. One, you are unable to have enough money for emergencies. Two, foreigners may not be willing to lend you the money, and you may struggle to arrange funds, and you may be forced to repay your loans earlier, and that will put another pressure on your foreign reserves. So this is a second drawback or second consequence. The third, the country will be forced to borrow from other countries. That we call external borrowing. You cannot buy import by printing your own currency. You need to have foreign currency to buy import. And if your foreign currency is not enough, your exports are not enough, it means you need to borrow money. And that borrowing will cost you not only a markup and interest rate, they may also, the lenders may also force you to surrender your political sovereignty. We've seen the case of IMF, that when IMF comes and Pakistan borrows money from IMF, many conditions have to be met, which probably result in the compromise of our political sovereignty. The fourth consequence of trade deficit is a downward pressure on the exchange rate. If exports are less than import, that means demand of currency is less than the supply. Because of export, your currency is demanded. Because of import, your currency is being supplied. So demand of your currency would be less than the supply of currency. That will put your currency in a surplus in the international market, in the foreign exchange market, and that would mean the currency could depreciate, could lose value, and that could, of course, trigger inflation, and there could be other consequences of a weaker currency. It's a topic for something else. So weaker currency is not good. So these are the reasons because of which countries are often concerned when trade deficit rises. But it won't be wrong to say that trade deficit is not always a cause of concern. In some cases, a trade deficit could be good. For example, if trade deficit is because of the import of machinery, it is because of the import of semi-finished goods, or because of the import of raw material. That means that maybe in future, because of the import of machines now, there is trade deficit, but in future, the production capacity, which you mentioned earlier, may get stronger, and in future, the country may start exporting more. So trade deficit is a cause of concern, as it leads to unemployment, it leads to a pressure on foreign exchange, and it leads to a pressure on exchange rate, and it forces you to borrow from other countries. But it may be good if it is because of the import of machinery and raw material. Trade deficit may also not be a cause of concern if it may be rising in terms of amount, but if it is falling as a percentage of your income. So a deficit is wrong, but if a deficit is falling as a percentage of your GDP, it means you are in a better position to bear that deficit. So a current account deficit may be rising in terms of the amount, but if it is falling as a percentage of GDP, it may not be a cause of concern. Thirdly, a trade deficit may indicate a better living standard. It may indicate that consumers are enjoying more goods and services than the goods the country is producing. So that could be indication that people are prosperous, people have affordability, people are affluent, and they are spending more. However, the cost of that high standard living may be paid by future generations, as this will result in more borrowing. But if trade deficit is followed or complemented by a surplus in services. Like in the case of America, America often talks about a huge trade deficit, but they forget that they have a trade deficit, but at the same time, they have a surplus in the export of services. So if you are having a trade deficit, but at the same time, you are having a surplus in other sections like services, like you are attracting foreign direct investment, trade deficit may not be a real cause of concern. Students taking AS examination of A-level economics may refer to two questions. One, specimen paper, question 5, part B, and the second is October-November 2023 exam paper. Variant is also 23, question 5B. So these two questions are from this topic of consequences of trade deficit. I hope you like this video. Thank you.